And then I'll pass things over to the wonderful Jarell Myers, who's one of our excellent trainers and clinicians, and he's going to talk today about using the invitation to change approach in his work with adolescents.
Please don't swell my head any further. It's already pretty big. I appreciate that introduction. Good evening, everyone. My name is Jarell Myers. I am a clinical psychologist. I do work with the Center for Motivation and Change's New York office. There, I work with adolescents, young adults, and families in addressing substance use issues, as well as issues with anxiety, depression, other mood disorders. For CMC, I've run groups as well. And I've done a few trainings for the foundation. I think on the foundation website, I am listed as like special projects, which basically means I'm the Swiss Army knife. So if you need me to do a training, I'll do that. If you need me to write something, I won't do it well, but I'll do that. Like whatever the foundation needs me for, I kind of jump in and do. Um, so my goal tonight is to talk to you a little bit about how I work with adolescents and their families using the invitation to change model. So I'm going to make the assumption that the majority of you, if not all of you, are already pretty familiar with the model itself. So I'm not necessarily going to go in depth with the model, but more so what I want to go through as we're going through the model is thinking through how I want to position parents and how I start interventions with adolescents in helping them to think through and grow awareness around themselves, what their use looks like, what some of the immediate urges are versus what long-term goals are. And so before we get started, I want the theme tonight to be mindfulness. I'm doing my best from the get-go to raise the awareness or bring into mindfulness the adolescent as well as for the parents themselves. That is the core of everything that I do. The reason why is because oftentimes for the adolescent, they are not paying attention to their internal cues. They're not paying attention to what they may be experiencing. And so I want to make sure that they begin to do that. So they're now cued into why they may be doing what they're doing. On the parents' end, I want them to be cued into both the anxiety and frustration that they may be feeling, as well as the grief that may be there at the possible loss of who this individual was, who they wanted their child to become. Um, just being able to deal with all of those feelings and emotions and not have them drive the parents in their attempt to help their loved one, right? So as we're going through all this, I want you to keep in mind awareness, right? That's at the core of everything that we're going to be discussing. Okay, so let me share my screen, and what I'm going to be sharing should not look unfamiliar to you. However, as I said, as we go through it, I'm going to be talking about um, the approach. Okay, so. You're familiar with the circle. You're familiar with everything that we talk about within the circle. So let's start with behaviors make sense, right? So we have an understanding that with behaviors make sense, our attempt is to aid in having both the individual and the family members understand why use is taking place. What are some of the things that are happening, right? And that if use was as simple as touching a hot stove, our loved ones would not engage in those behaviors, right? But because there is something that keeps pulling them back to the behavior, there's something they're getting out of it, right? That's why they keep going back to it. And so helping the families to understand that, I think, begins the process of shifting away from a sense of this is being done to me, or they are ruining their lives, or all of those things that may get in, all of those, excuse me, obstacles that may get in the way of me as a caregiver trying to help my loved one, and helps me now to have more empathy for the overall general experience. When you bring an adolescent into the picture, I find that for a lot of parents, that empathy is there, but it may be harder to access. And part of the reason why is that for adolescents, they are going through a stage in life where they're separating and individuating, meaning they're stepping away from being totally dependent on a parent and they're figuring out who they want to be, what their identity is, who they're attempting to be in this world, right? They're experimenting with, a bunch of different identities. They're experimenting with different ways of operating in the world. They're pushing boundaries and testing rules, and that can come up as something that causes a lot of tension and frustration in the home from time to time. Not for everyone, not all the time, but from time to time, right? So when we have an adolescent who begins to use a substance, a lot of times it's starting from a place of experimentation. But past that, it grows into this is something that I can use to medicate to help me deal with my anxiety or to help me feel like I fit in. Or it's something that I'm experimenting with as I'm discovering my own identity, right? All things that I think we can identify with as humans. That when we're going through that really confusing, really difficult stage of life, I'm trying to figure out as much as possible, and it feels difficult to do so. My body is in disarray, my emotions are all over the place, my hormones are all over the place. And having something that either numbs me or helps to keep me calm is something that I'm looking for. It's the aspirin for my headache, right? I think helping parents understand that at its core, right, the behavior that they may be seeing from their loved one, from their adolescent around these substance use behaviors, and in addition to that, any anxiety and depression that they may be experiencing, any extra sass that they may be experiencing, and all of that, that at its core, these are the issues that the adolescent is dealing with, right? So they're not just trying to, and when I say just, I don't mean like just as simply, but they're not just simply trying to get rid of a bad feeling. It is their way of coping with everything feeling as if it's a mess, and they're in the midst of it at all times. Helping parents to understand that, I think that unlocks some of the empathy that I'm looking to have them get. So that's my focus with behaviors make sense. I want parents to understand that this is a huge, huge mess for these kids. They're going through a ton. If we were just talking about them going through puberty, that would be bad enough. But if we're adding in puberty, mental health issues, social issues, cyberbullying, and all of those things, then it makes even more sense to me why someone would be using a substance, why this adolescent would be using a substance. For the adolescent, it is very difficult for them because they don't necessarily have the language that they need to describe their internal experiences. The word that gets on my nerves the most from adolescents, and there are quite a few of them, but this is the one that gets on my nerves the most. It is bad. The word bad. The reason why is because I don't understand what it means, and the definition differs from person to person. But all they know is when I use this substance, I don't feel bad. When I don't use a substance, I feel bad. I want to be able to have their behaviors make sense to them as well. So my focus is primarily on helping to model for them and scaffold for them, understanding their emotions. What do I mean by that? So I'm going to introduce a case and kind of walk us through how I incorporate the different aspects of the model with this case. But this is a he's now 17, but at the time I started seeing him, he was about a 15-year-old mixed race male living in New York, brought in by parents because of significant marijuana use. And once we did the intake together and began working together, there were some identity issues that he was having. He didn't know how he identified. He didn't know how he wanted to identify. It was at a time where there was much more of a magnifying glass, I would say, on racial issues in America. I mean, it's seems to be all the time right now, but there was much more of a magnifying glass on that because of we were just out of the George Floyd protests. and Black Lives Matter and all of that. And so I think he was really struggling with who he was. When we explored for him why he was using, initially he said, "Yeah, I'm just using because the rest of my external family uses, the black side of my family uses, and they're who I want to identify with. That it relaxes me. It's what my friends are doing." And so those are the things that I focus on when I'm thinking about use. Plus, I don't think it's that bad. It's not as bad as drinking alcohol. It's not as bad to him, his words. It's not as bad as like using caffeine on a daily basis or over consuming caffeine. So he had a lot of justifications for it. But when we dug deeper, what we discovered was that he really didn't know why he was using. And it wasn't until we dug deeper, we raised his awareness, we discovered that there was a ton of anxiety that was involved. When he was out in social situations, he was concerned about how he was being perceived by other people. And when he smoked, those thoughts magically went away and he actually was able to have fun with his friends, right? Without understanding that, just as a baseline, there's a huge difference between I'm smoking because it makes me feel good or I don't want to feel bad versus I'm smoking because when I don't, I feel really anxious. It makes it hard for me to hang out with my friends. The level of understanding there is significantly different, right? And we can understand that helps us then help our adolescent, but we don't necessarily understand what it does for that adolescent because now there's a higher level of understanding of themselves. We're actually working towards helping them with the identity and identification issues that we're hoping for them to explore and discover in this phase of life. So by helping I'm going to call him John, by John Doe, by helping John, and that's not his real name obviously, but helping John to identify that that was one of the primary reasons why he was using it. Didn't necessarily stop the use, but it raised his awareness. It also helped to raise the awareness of parents, because instead of thinking that this kid is just a degenerate who's smoking all the time, they now have a better understanding that this is a kid who's separating and individuating, as I discussed earlier, who's having some mental health issues, so he's feeling a ton of anxiety, and is smoking as a means of medicating to help him feel better. That increased the empathy that they had for this kid. And even in moments where he was being, let's call him a butt, when he was being a butt, right, towards them and being unkind towards them, even in those moments, they could still hold on to the empathy because they had an understanding that this is the mess that this kid was trying to work through and deal with. So when we think about behaviors making sense for the adolescent and the family, I do want to ensure that the parents have an understanding of what behaviors make sense for their adolescent. I also want to explain to them that there are extra features that are there that they're not necessarily considering that are playing a role in what's happening for their loved one. And then finally, what I want them to understand is that their loved one doesn't quite understand why they're using either. And so our job is to help them uncover that and open up communication so that we can clarify what's actually happening for them. Then when I'm working with the adolescent, it's just about raising the awareness of what's going on and why it's happening for them, right? So what's actually happening when we move some of the defenses away, when we get through some of that sass, when we can sit through it and sit together, what are we uncovering? What are you actually feeling? And what are your substances genuinely helping with? It's a lot of hard work with that because, as I said earlier, the adolescent doesn't have necessarily have the language for it. But the more that we can sit with them and be patient with them and dig through some of this stuff with them, is the more that we'll actually see that we can get to a point where their awareness is raised and they're able to speak more about what their internal experiences are. Okay. So past behaviors make sense. We move on to one size not fitting all. Now, this should be, I think, the most obvious with adolescents, right? Um, I think about my household, right? So when I was growing up, I'm the older child. I have one younger sister. Okay. You would never know that I was in the house. You would always know that my sister was in the house. And when we hit adolescence, it was even more pronounced. Okay. So even though we grew up in the same home, the way that my parents had to parent us was completely different. Similarly, when we're thinking about each adolescent that comes into this space, right, whether it's into a treatment space, whether in our home, our school, wherever they may be, we have to be thoughtful about how they're presenting and what it is that they may need from us, right? One size is never going to fit all for an adolescent. For John Doe, the primary thing that we are seeing from him is that he was dealing again with those identity issues, right? He wanted to figure out for himself how he could identify so that he could still fit in with friends, but be able to have a blueprint of who he is, right? As a mixed race child. If I came in hard and said, listen, this treatment is strictly about smoking weed and getting you off it and raising your awareness around weed, we wouldn't have worked together for 2 years. It would not have happened. My approach with him had to be one in which I had to get a hook in. So when I'm thinking about awareness with one size doesn't fit all, I have to be willing to go where the adolescent wants me to go, even if my alarm bells are going off around their use. It means that at a certain level, I have to be willing to be patient. I can't tell you the number of times where I've sat in my office and for at least a month or a month and a half, I played Uno with someone week in, week out with that adolescent. And the reason why is because they had no desire to see me. However, week 6 or week 4 or week 5, all of a sudden it was like a eureka bulb went off and they were open and willing to talk because at some level they had to build up trust that they had this space to talk and be themselves and to be open. For some other kids, week 1 we are talking about Power Rangers, or no, teens don't talk about Power Rangers. We're talking about Snapchat. I'm learning about Finstas. I'm learning about TikTok and all the TikTok dances. I'm learning how to do the dances. Like it depends on the kid. And so there has to be a level of flexibility. So when you're thinking about awareness with an adolescent around one size does not fit all, it is flexibility, but I think flexibility taken up a notch. I have to be patient and willing to meet an adolescent where they are, wherever that is. And it means that even if things are not going well, if I'm looking for long-term success, I have to be willing to be patient, especially in that beginning phase. Now, I'm the expert. I can sit with the kid and be patient. For a parent, when they have that kid come into my office, they want change and they want it now, right? I think of like the JG Wentworth commercials, if you ever watch like daytime television. Um, I want it like, what is it? I have a structured settlement and I need cash now, right? Like I need it now, right now. I have to have it now. And so for these parents, what they want right now is the ability to have this kid stop doing what they're doing and return to whatever image they had of their kid before. Oftentimes with these kids coming in, what I see is that these have been issues that have been going on for a really long time, and they've been holding things in a balance. When they're coming in to see me, I'm throwing things completely off balance for them. I'm taking away things that they've been using to cope, and now I'm shifting the way that they're operating out in the world, right? So even though that is the primary way in which I go about treating these kids, there has to be a ton of flexibility. On the parents' end, they have to be willing to be flexible and patient at the same time. If you cannot be flexible and patient, you are always going to buck up against with your adolescent this idea that I'm not doing what you say. If you've ever had an adolescent in your house, you know that no for them is a fight, right? I'm going to push against that. I'm going to push back against that because you're wrong. You don't know what you're talking about. You don't know what it's like to live in this world as it stands right now. You don't know what it's like, right? So there has to be a level of patience and flexibility. And this is going to take us all the way into the awareness section once we get there. But if I cannot be patient and flexible with my child, if I cannot acknowledge the fact that what worked for Jimmy down the street isn't going to work for Tommy in my house, if I can be patient and work with the fact that I'm truly just trying to build communication or I'm trying to find the right the right avenues to support them, right? And this is where extracurricular activities of any sort can come into play. This is where any sort of group or hobbies or anything like that, that comes into play, right? That it doesn't have to look like just coming into my office, but having flexibility and patience with whatever it is that could support these kids. Those are the things that we want to think about for the parents. So in summary, parents, flexibility, patience, openness to whatever it is that the kid wants to engage in that's pro-social and adaptive. For the kid, help being willing to sit with them and acknowledge that they are where they are, and wherever it is that we're going to go, we may take steps towards that, but it may be baby steps, and that's okay. If my goal is long-term success, starting out slow is totally fine by me. I forgot to say, I'm going to leave time at the end for questions. So if you have any questions, feel free to make a note of them, put them in the chat, whatever works for you. And we'll save the last half hour to answer any questions. Okay. Ambivalence is normal. If you thought it was normal for a young adult or an adult, it is absolutely normal for an adolescent. Remember, they're going through a stage in life called separation and individuation, right? If they're separating and individuating, means that they're stepping out into the world and figuring things out for themselves, right? At the same time, there is a recognition that they still need to depend on their parents or guardians to take care of them. So I'm pushing back against you, like, get away from me. I don't want to hug you anymore. But then at the same time, I need money to go to the, I don't think kids go to the mall anymore, but go to the mall, right? Or go shopping for something, right? Like, or a gift. Whatever kids get nowadays. Like, I need money for that, right? So they're always bouncing back and forth in this place of ambivalence around a ton of different things. When it comes to substances, once we've raised their awareness, once they have a better understanding of what's going on and why they're using, it doesn't necessarily mean that they want to stop. As a matter of fact, they may want to experiment with continuing doing it in different ways because in their minds feels like I can hold that. I can still hold on to that. I can still do that, right? When I'm working with an adolescent and I'm sitting with their ambivalence, even more than I would for a young adult, I'm taking a step back. And the reason why I'm taking a step back is because I know I have my own biases. I know that I want them to stop smoking. I know that I want them to stop drinking, right? And so I'm more likely to be another adult in their life who's telling them what to do if I'm leaning into their biases, leaning into my biases, excuse me. Whereas if I'm choosing not to lean into my biases, if I can take an even further step back, if I can give them even more space to really contemplate things, my expectation isn't necessarily that they're going to go in the direction that I want them to go in, but it's much more so that I'm giving them the space to process. For me, when I'm working with an adolescent, that space to process is quite possibly the most important thing. And here's why. I'm thinking about the fact that them processing their thoughts is a useful tool for the rest of their lives. It's something that they can use to really think through and problem solve whatever may come their way. And even though I may want them to stop smoking as heavily as they've been smoking, I also want them to be able to use their skills and tools in an effective way so that I don't have to come into my office anymore. As a caregiver or a parent, I think it's also really, really important for you to take a step back, an even bigger step back than you might do with an adult or a young adult, because you want your kids, you want your adolescents to develop this skill set, right? To be able to weigh up the pros and cons, to be able to bounce back and forth, but acknowledge that they're bouncing back and forth. The other thing is that because of, I think there's a heightened level of emotion at this phase in life, they are more prone to shame. And they combat shame with anger, with pushback, with sass, right? So when, let's say, Johnny says, I'm going to stop smoking, and then 2 days later they end up smoking, they're beating up on themselves already pretty heavily. They're gone into defensive mode as to why it was okay for them to smoke in that moment or whatever the case may be. And when we acknowledge that that happened, when we're trying to better understand what went wrong, there's a lot of shame that they're carrying around the fact that they did not hold to their word, right? If we as parents, caregivers, treatment providers, whomever, if we can take an even bigger step back and be able to just hold the picture up for them, saying, this is what it is, right? I'm not saying right, I'm not saying wrong, but help me understand what was going on. I think it gives them even more of an opportunity to process. But if it feels at any point in time for them as if we may be biased towards scolding or we may be biased towards, them not smoking again or whatever the case may be, we're more likely to get that pushback from them. I think that these adolescents that we're seeing nowadays are more sensitive to that shame, and so are more sensitive to our approaches with ambivalence. And if we cannot hold our biases in, then we're more likely to push them in the other direction. This is another plug for that awareness section that we're about to get into. As parents, we have to do an incredible job of holding our own awareness with these adolescents, especially for the ones that are using. If we cannot do that, we're just going to keep hitting against defensive barriers that they're putting up, right? So your patience, your flexibility, your willingness to be aware of how you're feeling and where you are and what your goals and values are, that's going to be key here. For John Doe, what we saw for him is that once he became aware of the fact that he was using from an anxiety standpoint, and I started to talk to him about the fact that anxiety was just feeding into the weed use and he wasn't actually using it recreationally, which was important for him. He had an understanding of it, but he was still kind of going back and forth because he understands that anxiety is there, but it doesn't take away from the fact that when he smokes, he can hang out with his friends. When he smokes, he can feel better. He can be more social. So there were months on end where we were bouncing back and forth between, okay, I'm gonna stop and I'm gonna work on my anxiety. And it's not that important. I'm much rather hang out with my friends, especially over the summer, right? Parents initially in that situation, the John Doe's parents, they were flustered by this, as you can imagine, because it was almost as if their hopes went up that he's changing his behaviors, and then everything came crashing back down. And then it started going up again, and they started getting nervous that at some point the other shoe was going to drop, and then quote unquote other shoe dropped, right? What I was able to do with them was shift their understanding. So instead of looking at it as this is an up and down roller coaster and we're staying in the same spot, think of it as we're increasing the likelihood that in the future he's not going to use or that he's going to use much more responsibly. But in order to get there, remember, change is not a straight line. We're kind of going up and down, right? So there are moments where it seems as if things are lower than other moments that we've had before. But if we're to look at the trajectory of everything, we're actually moving forward, moving up, right? He's gaining more awareness. John, is gaining more awareness. He's thinking more and processing more about his use and about what he wants to do with his anxiety. He's starting to learn how to engage with his peers without substances. And based on that, we're getting somewhere. It's again baby steps. It's not necessarily where we want to be, but we're building towards it. We're building towards it. Okay. So that's our understanding section. Next, I want to move into self-awareness. Now, typically when we talk about self-awareness, we've talked about it as it relates to the parents. But remember, from the get-go, I said that we're focusing on mindfulness, right? I want both parties to be aware of what's going on for them, right? So when we think about self-awareness, right, we've broken it down into the two parts, right? So what are your goals and values? Oh, sorry, I'm going in the wrong direction. Oh, nope, going in the wrong direction. We're looking at your goals and values and your reasoning behind doing what you're doing, right? Why is all of this important to you? How aware are you of your internal experience, right? What do you need to do for yourself to ensure that you're taken care of, right? Obviously, for parents of adolescents who are not using substances, self-awareness is really, really important, right? Because you're dealing with their mess, right? Their hurricane. So you're trying to walk them through this phase of life that feels really difficult for them. When we add in substances or mental health issues to that piece as well, what we're seeing is that it's an even bigger storm. And so if I am not at a place where my gas tank is on full or close to full, if I'm running on empty, then I'm going to be completely burned out by the time I try to deal with all these different issues that may be happening, right, as a parent. So obviously, we need self-awareness to be present for these parents because I want them to be aware of what they're capable of or what they have the tolerance for in any given moment. And if they cannot tolerate or cannot deal with something, then it means that we've got to take a step back and then come back to it. The way that we saw it with John's parents is exactly that. Mom was the one who got activated. Dad was a little bit more relaxed and low key. And so we had them playing tag team, right? So when mom was talking to Johnny, um, and she noticed herself starting to elevate, her emotions starting to rise, she tagged in dad, right? Literally, I had them do like a hand clap, tag in almost like a wrestling match, and dad came in and dad took over and dad dealt with it while mom went on a walk or mom watched some TV or listened to music or locked herself away in her office, but did what needed to be done to ensure that temperature stayed low in the home and that everybody was taking care of themselves or parents were taking care of themselves. Now, in addition to that, we talked about this with John himself. The reason why is because of what I said earlier. John's awareness, John's language for why he was using and what his internal experiences were very low, which means that the skill set around dealing with whatever he was experiencing was also really low. He was not paying attention to how he was feeling. He was not paying attention to his physical body. So I wanted to raise his awareness. We focus on that again because it's a lifetime skill for this individual. But then also, if I've raised your awareness around that, you can now generalize and think more clearly about moments that come up where you're more likely or less likely to use. When you're with your friends, what's happening there? What's going to cause you to use versus what is not going to cause you to use. So with John, what we saw was once we started to raise his awareness little by little around how much anxiety he was experiencing and when he was experiencing that anxiety, he actually started to do things that would help to decrease the amount of anxiety that he was experiencing. Now, it didn't immediately decrease the amount of marijuana that he was smoking, but what we did see was that he was more likely to use a skill or tool to help him deal with his internal experience. That's priceless. That is a foundational piece for making, if it's making his weed use recreational, it's the foundational piece of making his weed use recreational. And if not, it's about then making his weed use disappear, right, for that individual. Because now I actually have tools and skills that I can use to help me when I'm feeling uncomfortable. The second part of the awareness section is willingness, right? We're really familiar with willingness. And with willingness, it, as you remember, it's about coming to terms with the fact that what is to be will be, right? I want my loved one to be okay, and on the other side, I have to deal with all the pain, and the pain is what shows me how much I care and how much I love my loved one, right? They interact with each other, two sides of the same coin. This was a critical key for the parents. I spoke in the beginning about the grief for parents in losing who they thought their loved one was going to be. This family that I've been talking about so far has two kids, right? The older brother went off to an Ivy League university, has a career in finance that is just getting started. Parents are really proud. Parents are both high achievers. This younger kid, John, didn't seem to be that. They had high hopes that John was going to be the next, you know, guru of some sort, right? Brilliant this, doing whatever at based out of some Ivy League university. And that wasn't John's lot in life. That's not how he saw himself. That's not the direction he wanted to go in. Part of willingness was having parents accept that that wasn't going to happen for him. Maybe it might, but as of right now, that's not what's going to happen for them. And having them come to terms with those feelings of sadness and frustration and letting go of the fact that that dream that they had for John may not pan out the way that they wanted it to pan out. What we helped them to focus on was that their dream for John was John being successful in life, whatever that meant. That John was able to live his life the way that he wanted to live it. So they had to learn to become willing to accept that. For John, he had to become willing to accept that I've got to deal with my anxiety, that it's uncomfortable, but that if I want to get to where I want to go to, and John is a creative, if I want to get to where I want to get to, then smoking all day is not going to get me there. So I have to pick up this coin where on one side I'm holding my ambivalence and I really want to continue smoking, and it's painful to have to let that go because it's been so helpful to me. But on the other side is where I want to see myself. Having both parties acknowledge their own willingness built empathy towards the willingness of others. So John could accept that parents had a dream for him and that that dream wasn't going to be met. And even though it took some time for him to get there, he was able to acknowledge, you know what? Maybe that is painful for my parents. And for parents, them being able to acknowledge that John has used weed as a means of coping, and now that he's not using it or doesn't have it in the picture anymore, that is painful for him. And he's having to sit with the fact that he's now living life without his pain relief. When we got them to acknowledge each other's willingness, the level of empathy between parties was incredible. The level of understanding between parties was incredible. It wasn't a miracle worker. It didn't mean that everything was perfect afterwards. But what it did mean is that they were starting to see each other eye to eye. I'm seeing you on the plane that you're on. And then lastly is self-compassion. Again, we wanted to focus on self-compassion for both parties. Or excuse me, both parents, both of John's parents are high achievers, right? They hadn't necessarily paid attention to compassion for themselves because they've been really busy just like keeping the household in order, paying for college, and making sure that their youngest John was staying on track. When we introduced the idea of self-compassion to them, they weren't happy about it. And the reason why is because it felt too mushy. They're accustomed to like work hard, pull yourself by your own bootstraps, get going, and you can do it. But what we help them to understand is that in order to be the most effective that you can be, it means that you have to acknowledge where you are. It means that you have to acknowledge the fact that this is all new for you. It means that you have to acknowledge that when we're incorporating new skills, you're going to suck at it. You're going to be terrible at it. And that's okay. But that self-compassion can help to encourage you to keep moving forward. We also help them build compassion between each other. So there were certain weaknesses that dad had and certain weaknesses that mom had. And mom was able to be compassionate towards dad, which increased dad's compassion towards himself, and vice versa. So it was like this beautiful marriage of compassion that was happening there once we got the train going. The importance, I think, of self-compassion in working with adolescents is that they're going to pull on your strings a lot more, right? They know what buttons to push and press at any given time, right? Whether it's to get what they want out of you or to have some emotion come up or whatever it is, right? Whatever the case may be, right? If I can take that step back, be compassionate towards myself and acknowledge where I am and what I need and all of those things, then when I slip, meaning when I yell or something like that, I can acknowledge that it happened and work towards doing it differently in the future. And that's what we saw happen with John's parents. For John, I think that it was very difficult for him to have compassion for self because his identity was tied into what he thought parents wanted out of him and the rebellion against that, right? Him being a creative as opposed to him being a more traditional, whatever it is that parents want him to be, finance guy or doctor, lawyer, engineer, etc. So when we began working on compassion for him, what we had to do was start to separate for him what his identity was versus who he thought parents wanted him to be. And being able to acknowledge that that vision of whatever parents wanted him to be doesn't have to be what it is, right? I'm allowed to decide for myself who I want to be and what I want to work towards becoming. And that, I think, empowered him to move forward, right? Um, the compassion piece also, I think, helped him as he began to take steps away from using or attempt to take steps away from using. Meaning that when he had a slip, he could acknowledge that these were the reasons that the slip happened and that we could plan towards doing things differently. And instead of beating up on himself, which he was really good at. Instead, he could help himself by acknowledging that universal sense that everyone has made this mistake or had difficulty with it in the past, and that he's just another human being who's having a struggle with it, right? So, what I want you to take from the awareness section is that overall, we're not just focused on the awareness of the parents or the family members who are involved, but we want to also raise the awareness of the adolescent. Again, because it's a really important skill for them to have in general, but also because it helps to now build a bridge between the parties. So instead of it feeling as if we are fighting against each other, it actually feels as if we're working together because I have a better understanding of you and I have a better understanding of myself. Okay. So then practicing all of this, right? Which is at the core of the model itself. With parents, it was practicing over and over with each other and role playing how they were going to talk to each other, what or how they were going to talk to John, excuse me, what they were going to say, what was going to work or what was much more likely to work versus what was least likely to work. We'd have family sessions. And so the parents would be over in their corner working with their therapist, practicing and role playing what they were going to say. I was going to be working with John, practicing and role playing what he was going to say. And it was almost as if we were like putting on a play for that the first few family sessions, right? Where the parents had their scripts and John had his script and we're just kind of talking at each other, but we're using these scripts and using these words and becoming more comfortable with it. But over time, instead of preparing and having these scripts, what we started seeing in the family sessions and then outside of the family sessions, because we had practiced speaking in this way, is that moments where things might have been tense because there were difficult conversations that needed to happen, they weren't happening. Or they were decreasing, the temperature rise was a lot lower than it had been in the past. And the reason why is because they had practiced being able to communicate much more effectively with each other. So with with the adolescent here, we want to encourage them practicing these same exact skills that we've encouraged parents to practice because we want to encourage communication, because we want to improve on empathy, because we want them to have a better understanding of themselves and why they're doing what they're doing. So practice is not just here to ensure that the parents are doing their part most effectively, but it's also really important for the kids, the adolescents, to see it and engage in it as best as possible. Okay. And then finally, the communication and the behavioral tools. So there's no real difference here. What I encourage parents to do around communication is spend time before even listening, before offering information, before surfing, before any of that stuff. I ask them to focus on moments when their adolescent is at a red light versus when they're at a green light. What cues indicate to you that that kid is at a red light? What cues indicate to you that that kid is at a green light? And the importance of that is, regardless of what we do in terms of addressing communication moving forward, if you can identify when your kid is least likely to hear you, then you're more likely to not engage with them in that moment, which means that we've taken down tension in the house. We're we're removing the chance that it turns into a shouting match and that nobody actually hears each other. And we're increasing the likelihood that when they are at that green light, that they're more likely to listen to you and hear you, right? I also taught John about red lights and green lights, being able to identify for himself so that he could communicate it to his parents. And it actually became, all right, mom and dad, like, I hear you, but right now I'm at a red light. I need to take a walk. And that ended the conversation. No hard feelings. Everybody was able to part ways. And then an hour later, come back and see if he could be at a green light at that point in time. When we think about the offering information and surfing, it's again, it's the same way that I would approach it with a young adult or with an adult, but I'm paying way more attention to those red lights and green lights because of how incendiary it could become in the household with having an adolescent who like I said earlier, is dealing with all of that mess, right? So with communication tools with an adolescent, I definitely want to focus on their red and green lights in addition to all the other skills. For the behavioral tools, it is 1000% catching these kids being good. Here's the difference, or not the difference. Here's the thing that I focus in on with adolescents. You have got to be sincere with them. There's no way you can say, "Hey, good job," but not really mean it because for whatever reason, these adolescents have the greatest BS meter on the planet. They can pick up when you're BSing them at all times. And so if it doesn't feel genuine and sincere, it doesn't even make any sense for you to say it. They're not gonna lean into it. They're not gonna lean into it. They're not gonna take it in. It's not going to work the way that you want it to, right? So, if we're going to be effective at truly catching them when they are being good, it means that we have to be genuine and sincere in how we're providing that reinforcement. It means that whatever that reinforcer is coming from a place where I'm able to tolerate what I'm feeling and I'm able to give you this thing based on your behaviors. It also means, right, that we have to hold to our word as parents, right? So, if you remember from the training, right, behaviors don't just come by themselves, right? So, we gave the example of a young man who comes to his dad and says, "Hey, dad, me and my friends drank your whiskey last night," right? And we ask the question, what are you drawn to as a parent? Obviously, it's the drinking of the whiskey. What do you want to reinforce? Well, obviously, it's the fact that this kid has come to you and told you the truth, right? I have to be, as a parent, really keen to tap into what I'm trying to get to and not as much where they are right now. Meaning, if my kid is coming to me and saying, "Hey, I apologize, I drank the whole bottle of whatever it was last night, me and my friends, all of that," I want to make sure that I am tapping in as much as possible to those behaviors that I want to see happening again. I want you to come back and talk to me and be truthful with me, so I need to praise the heck out of it. It doesn't mean that I'm agreeing with the behavior. It means that I want to see you telling the truth over and over again. So I've got to do whatever I can to highlight that. I want you to see that you're going to get a good result out of being honest with me and being open with me. So I'm going to praise the heck out of it. You almost have to be on top of your game at all times when you're working on these behavioral reinforcements. Now that feels impossible and you're never going to be that, but I ask parents to aim for that because if you shoot for the moon, you land amongst the stars. That's the exact thing that I need from you here. I want you to land amongst the stars. So if you're paying attention as much as possible to the things that you want to see out of this adolescent and you're praising those things, then you're more likely to have them increase that as you're reinforcing it, right? It doesn't mean that you're ignoring the bad behaviors. It means that you're highlighting the good ones, right? Now, the other thing is, even if you do this perfectly, and I mean absolutely perfectly, I can almost guarantee it that the first few times that you do it, they're going to roll their eyes, they're going to be sarcastic, they might even be mean to you because whatever, you're making fun of me or whatever. It's not that big of a deal, right? They can't take it in, they can't hold it. That is okay. That is perfectly fine. They may not be able to hold it. I'll take it. That's fine. What's most important is the consistency with it. Remember, what we're asking of these adolescents is a lifestyle change. If they've been doing something, so let's say they've been using for the past year, 1 year out of 15 years is a really long time. So they've formed this habit that they've been engaging in for a significant portion of their life. If we're asking them to change that, we're asking them to take the time, the energy, and the effort to not do that thing and to do something else for a significant portion of their life, and then perhaps moving forward. That feels uncomfortable. So the more comfortable that we can make it for the adolescent, the better. Let me tell you something. John has a mouth on him, okay? John John has a mouth on him, okay? So even though parents were catching John being good, whether it's about his grades, whether it's about taking the dog out for a walk, whether it's about taking out the garbage or getting up and being active, right? John is an avid reader, so if it was about reading, didn't matter, right? John would snap back at them. The first month, month and a half, 2 months almost, would snap back at them. Parents would come back like, this is not working, right? He's not listening to us. But the more and more that they remained consistent was the more and more that John saw that this was not about making fun of him or being sarcastic, and it was mostly about being acknowledging the fact that he was doing something that fell in line with all three's goals and values. That's what was happening. And so because of the parents' consistency, John was able to see that. He actually started rewarding them for their behavior in terms of them being parents for their behavior, in terms of how they were communicating with him, right? He would say like, I appreciate it, thank you, all that stuff. And that really resonated with parents. And so it became this really nice cycle. Now, it didn't happen all the time. And I'm still working with John to this day, which means that everything isn't perfect and wonderful and fixed. I'm a miracle worker, but I'm not that good, right? However, from where we started to where we are now, there have been significant changes within the family unit because we've raised awareness within the family unit as a whole, not just focusing on one individual piece, but overall using the ITC model. I think what we ended up seeing from John is that there's an increased awareness of why he's doing what he's doing, more choice in what he's doing, meaning that he's spending more time actually thinking about when he wants to smoke versus when he doesn't want to smoke and why he wants to do that. An overall reduction in his anxiety, which has led to an overall reduction in the tension in the home and much more communication and openness in the home. Parents, I think, feel more connected with John, and that has helped the whole family system as a whole. Now, that is my star case. I'm working with a bunch of other adolescents, and we're working through this, and it's not as pretty. I'm not going to lie to you. None of this is pretty, right? All of it has different pieces that will come to the fore and will present different challenges. And we're always trying to figure out how to specify this for each individual family. So there's no one way to go about doing this. But I think by helping the family unit incorporate the invitation to change model, what we help them to do is have a better understanding of selves and others. And when you're working with an adolescent, if nothing else, getting them to understand themselves and have empathy for others is essential. Thank you very much for taking the time to listen to me. I've spoken very quickly. I hope you've caught stuff. And if you have any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them. Let me unshare my screen. Please feel free to jump in with any questions that you may have. You can just shout them out. You don't have to raise hands. That's fine.
Hi, this is Lisa. I can't turn my camera on, but
No
I have
worries,
a
Lisa.
question.
Sure.
Yeah, I guess I'm wondering when kids are having a hard time, how you think about punishment versus motivation, because I am working with a family whose daughter is smoking weed and they were freaked out
Yep.
So we're doing a lot of the things that we're doing that you talked about today, but they talked to another provider who said that they should take the car away from her because they want her to take a class on cannabis use, and she's very ambivalent about taking it. So I
Yeah.
said to them, I don't know about taking away the car if you feel like she's safe enough to drive, but like, wouldn't it be helpful if you just said, if you take this class, we'd love to take you out for dinner. We really appreciate it. And she said, well, she's just going to say it's a bribe. And I said, well, you can say it's a bribe, or you're grateful that she's willing to do this, however she wants to look at it, but this is how you would approach it. So I was wondering what you think about that. And also, I think parents are more likely to punish and withdraw, and I think that gets them nowhere.
I'm shaking my, I don't know if you can see Lisa, but
Yes, I can. Thank
okay,
you.
perfect. I'm shaking my head, or nodding, or whichever means yes. Yes, I am in total agreement with you, right? I don't think that punishment gets us as far as setting limits does. And I think the difference between punishment and setting limits is that with punishment, I think of it as me personally. So I'm not speaking on behalf of FFC. Me personally, I think of punishment as reactionary. I think of setting limit as proactive, right? If I establish for you what the grounds are, what the ground rules are for playing the game, then I'm being proactive so that if you decide to push against or break the rules, that's your decision and you're making the choice to take on whatever the consequence of that action is, right? Whereas if I'm taking away this thing from you, it can feel as if it's reaction, in reaction to something that's happening, and that feels very different. It feels as if you're enforcing that on me. So what I try to do for parents is try to get them to a place where they're more so setting limits and even more so focusing on the positive behaviors that they want to have the kid engage in. I totally agree, right? You want to call it bribery? Fine, call it bribery. We can call it Skittles. We can call it grass. We can call it whatever you want to call it. I'm totally okay with that as long as it gets you into the class, right? Because that's the most important thing, right? So what can we do to help get you into that class so you actually get there? Perhaps they plant some seeds with you that we can have grow and develop over time, and that you can learn from, right? If getting into the class is the most important behavior for me, we can call it whatever you want to call it, but I want to get you into that position.
All right,
And
great. Thank you very much.
thank you so much for that question. Paula, I see your hand up.
Hi, Jarell. Yeah, I've got two separate issues working with parents. One issue, it's extremely common that they give their kids a lot of money, and they
Yeah.
always have. I mean, I've got one parent that gives her son $1,000 a month. He's
Wow.
20 years old, he lives at home. And then a separate, different issue, number two, and you can address them however you choose, is in a divorce situation where I've got the non-custodial parent is really invested in learning these techniques and these approaches. The custodial parent is not only not interested, but doesn't even acknowledge that there's a problem of a high potency THC problem with their 17-year-old. Like she
Mhm.
accepts it, everybody does it. She sounds just like the 17-year-old.
Mhm.
So there's this dynamic on how is dad going to be successful in that situation? And then the other situation, how can I approach parents in a way where they can set limits regarding the money?
Yeah. So let me start with the second issue first, which is dad on board with ITC, mom not on board with ITC. So one thing that I think about is the fact that, or one thing that I talk about often in these trainings is the fact that not everybody's going to be working from this playbook, right? So when I'm speaking to parents, right, what I say to them is you're going to start incorporating all this stuff and your loved one is going to look at you like, what are you doing and why are you acting this way? This doesn't make any sense, right? And that's because they're not operating from the same rule book that you're operating from. And they've seen you behave a certain way for an extended period of time, and now you're doing something completely different. So it's thrown them off, right? But the key there is that not everybody's going to operate from that playbook. So even if you have both parents in the household doing that thing, when they get to the workplace, when they're out with their friends, when they're at school, when they're everywhere else in the world, the world is not interacting with them in that way. We can try to control as much as we can control, but there's only so much that we can control, right? I have to be willing to accept that I'm doing my part, and my part is going to be enough for right now, and that's the best that I can do until I can do better, right? I think for dad, just because mom is not on board, and maybe she's even completely working against him, doesn't mean that he doesn't continue doing what he's doing. It doesn't mean that he needs to stop reinforcing the behaviors that he wants to see. It doesn't mean any of those things, right? It actually means that he should pump it up as much as he possibly can, as much as he's able to tolerate, right? Because he has maybe a bit more that's going against what he's saying or what he's attempting to do, but it doesn't take away the value of it, right? Um, so I think it's going to be a harder road for sure.
Right.
And I think a lot of parents are facing these high THC problems, right? And you have a lot of external influences that are indicating that this is not that big of a deal. But it doesn't mean that we can't be effective as parents in working with our loved ones by incorporating this model and really, really reinforcing the behaviors that we want to see. As
So
it relates to the money issue, um, look, the 20-year-old has become accustomed to having like that lifestyle, right? And I think if we are I'm thinking it kind of depends on what the parents want to see, right? What is it that they'd like to have occur differently, and how can they encourage that happening, right? So right now, that $1,000 is attached to just being alive, right? It does not necessarily have to stay that way, right? And it doesn't mean that we're punishing this kid or removing privileges. It's much the more I'm thinking of it more as all right, you've gotten your signing bonus, now you got to work for your money a little bit, right? So giving him the opportunity to now do something, and I might start smaller just to kind of get him in the momentum of doing something, whatever it is, but kind of help him build up towards, wherever it is that mom would like to see him. And if we can attach maybe extra money to that, or if she wants, there are perhaps other things that aren't as tangible, like maybe quality time or, paying for a gym or whatever it is. But doing stuff that, he might be interested in or engaged in and that type of thing. But that is a tough one. That's why I answered it second. That's a tough one.
yeah, thank you so much. It really is. And I asked her, can you have him do jobs around the house? Oh, there's nothing for him to do around here. So, it's a
Yeah,
challenge, and I
it's tough.
appreciate your feedback. And same with the dad and the mom dynamic. I just try to keep bringing him back to him.
Yeah.
Let's,
Yeah.
that your ex-wife is over here and she's on her journey and relationship with your son, and that's theirs. Let's focus on you and what you can work on to change the dynamic of your relationship between you and your son.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your question, Paula. Elizabeth, I see your hand.
Hello, good evening.
Hi.
Thank you for this. I have a lot of parents who have kids with significant substance use disorders, and they're minors, and they really feel stuck. And I understand them feeling stuck, but the kids don't go to school. They don't leave their room. Um, they don't work. And the parents just don't know what to do with punishment, not punishment. And, we say, try to find the positive, try to find something good. And it is, and so do these children maybe need rehab? Yes. But then depending on certain states that you live in, they can't be forced. If they're between 14, it's really tricky. So any suggestions, things that I can give to them would be really appreciated.
Yeah. So my background is in working with adolescents. So yeah, before I came to CMC, I worked with like adolescents and kids who struggled with anxiety. And one of the things that was helpful for me in that was like I thought about anxiety as a bad behavior, a behavior that I wanted to extinguish, right? So I wanted to help families reinforce brave behaviors and reduce the amount of anxiety-provoking behavior or anxiety-based behaviors that the kids were engaging in. And especially when you had someone who's like, let's say, school avoidant, I wanted to make school avoidance feel uncomfortable and going to school feel a little bit more comfortable. So I went about doing that by reinforcing school and things around school, and then not reinforcing, let's say, being at home. So we did things like, um, if you're going to be at home, you know, cell service is down or there's no Wi-Fi or things that made being at home feel a little bit less comfortable. You didn't have access to TV. The only reading material you had was like the daily newspaper, like that type of thing. So even though it's still more comfortable than being at school or going to work or whatever the case may be, it's not as comfortable as it could be or not as reinforcing as it could be. And then,
Thank you, because a lot of these kids also have, right, anxiety, generalized
yeah,
depressive disorder. Yeah, they have,
yeah,
it kind of goes hand in hand. And then you
exactly.
have ADHD and just
Yeah,
all kinds of stuff. So,
yeah,
yeah, thank you.
yeah. And I just to follow up on that, I think the other thing too is like having like having the having the parents be aware of all the other pieces that are playing a role in their loved one's substance use and um working towards having that kid possibly work on those individual issues. Now, from my experience, and this is what makes it so hard, there are not a lot of places that work with teens who are using substances and have mental health issues. They'll typically ask them to deal with the mental health issues, no, the substance use issues first, and then you get to deal with the mental health issues as if they don't go hand in hand. And I think if there's space to have these kids like work with someone who maybe specializes in whatever it is that the kid is struggling with, that's at least a first step because reduction in symptoms often leads to a reduction in use. Thanks so much for that question, Elizabeth. Anybody else have thoughts, comments, concerns, questions?
Jarell, hi, it's Anne Marie.
Hi,
I,
Anne.
how are you?
Good. How are you?
Great. This was awesome. It really was great. I really appreciated it and took a lot of notes. And even after just in the last few minutes, said to my husband, we got this information a little bit late, but I'm certain it kept our son alive. And we
Mhm.
did the role playing. We used to meet at the diner together, and one of us would play him, and we'd be like, so this is what we want to ask him, and the other was able to say like, yeah, this is what he's going to say. So you kind
Yeah.
of like uh took me through some years ago. He's 37 now, and he's alive. We're still trying. Like you said, he's not, in your case with John, he's not perfect, but I loved everything you said because I do talk to a lot of adolescent parents, and it's a tough sell sometimes.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
just great. Kudos. Thank you so much.
No, thank you so much for that, Marie. So happy that you were able to share that. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Awesome. Uh, will the PowerPoint be available first? I don't know. Maybe it will be available. I can make it available if you'd like. I will say like there's n no new information in it. It's information that you all are probably pretty familiar with, but if you'd like to take a look at it, you're more than welcome to. Go ahead, Tracy.
Was trying to find my raise hand button.
You're fine.
So when I first got involved with the invitation to change, one of the hardest sections for me personally was around awareness because, from a personal standpoint, I did not spend especially a lot of my adulthood thinking about self-awareness or willingness and much less self-compassion. But I'm really curious, and I think I get it pretty much when working with the parents around, their goals and values. Is it, if you were talking to these parents with adolescents, do the adolescents also understand goals and values? Are they there yet? Are they just in the moment? Or are they aware that they might have goals? You said that they have a great deal of shame around, a lot of what they're doing. So I know that there's that part of awareness, but I wonder, how just going back and to revisit this section for adolescents, what can parents do more of in helping their child increase their self-awareness? Can they
Yeah.
talk about values? Um, and
Yeah.
like I gotta say, like Anne Marie, boy, I wish I'd had this stuff 15 years ago, not more. But anyway, this is awesome stuff, Jarell.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, my pleasure. That's a great question, Tracy. Thank you so much for offering, or for asking, sorry. So, I would say that for the majority, and this is totally anecdotal, but for the majority of adolescents that come in and see me, they are not at a place where they're able to identify their goals and values. And it's not because they cannot, it's because it's stuff that they just never thought about before. Now, it doesn't mean that they don't have established goals and values that they're working towards or working around or working with. It's just that there hasn't necessarily been language put on those things. So, what I'll do in office is I have like an exercise that I'll do that helps them to identify their goals and values. It is what is it called? I will make sure I send out an email or have an email sent out with the name of the cards. I think you probably get them on Amazon. But there are lists of like a bunch of different values, and they just kind of put them into different piles and figure out which ones are, which ones the top 10 that are most important to them, right? No, and there's an understanding that those values may change over time and all of that stuff, but that like as of right now, today, August 14th, 8:15 p.m. These are the goals and values that are most important. These are the values that are most important to me. These are the goals that are attached to these values. Um, Outside of that, even if I didn't do that exercise, I think in how we listen to the adolescents, it helps us to better understand what are some of the goals and values that are driving them at this point. So what are the things that you're consistently hearing? What are the things that what are the things that you notice that they're working towards or they're attempting to do? Even if you're not necessarily, yes, values card sort. Thank you so much, Brenda. Yes. So, what are the things that you're hearing from them? What are the things that you're consistently seeing from them? What are the things that you know you see them working towards, or you see them taking more interest in? And then based on that, what are they doing to move towards those things versus what are they doing to move away from those things? Um, I think helping to identify that may not necessarily identify specific goals and values for each individual adolescent, but I think it helps to raise awareness of their internal narratives and why they're doing what they're doing, which I think is the most important thing for them. So they may not necessarily be able to say, like, family is an important value for me, or education is an important value for me, but they'll be able to say, I really enjoy spending time with my family, or I really enjoy, history class, right? We're learning Greek history. It's important to me, or I really like it. That those things help to kind of guide. And so if I have a sense of what those things are, for me personally, when I'm working with an adolescent, I try to weigh that up for them. So you really like history class, but you're skipping history class to smoke, right? Help me understand that. Like it feels like you're not able to live up to your values because weed's getting in the way. How can we shift that? or you really want to spend time with family, but you run off to go drink by yourself so that nobody sees you. So you're not actually spending time with them. You're drinking by yourself instead of spending time with them. It feels like drinking is getting in the way of this value for you, right? So it's not necessarily that I'm calling it, or not necessarily that I'm judging them for it, but I'm more so like helping them to identify the things that are important and then helping them to see the ways in which substances or other things are getting in the way of that. Now weigh all that up for me. Make it make sense for yourself and then make it make sense for me. Thanks so much for that question, Tracy. Any other thoughts or questions before we wrap up this evening? Okay. Well, I again want to thank you all so much for joining us this evening. This was such a pleasure taking the time to speak with you all. I appreciate your questions, your attentiveness, and everything. So grateful for your comments and for your feedback. Um, you all have a great evening, and I think we will see you next quarter.
Yes, and the recording and everything will be sent out next week. Have a
Take
good
care, everyone.
Bye.